Welcome everyone to our 7th UIW Red Talk. I'm Dr. Lisa McNary, Dean of Alumni and Parent Relations, and I am so glad that you are joining us here today. We have some of you on Zoom, and the majority of our folks like to join us on Facebook Live, so welcome to all of you out there. We will answer your questions, but we're going to hold them all until the end of the presentation. But please feel free to use the chat on Zoom and ask your questions as well on Facebook Live, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. We do have a special treat for you this evening. We have one of UIW's most favorite professors. So I'm going to read her bio. We have Dr. Lopita Nath. Dr. Nath is the chair of the History Department and the coordinator of the Asian Studies program at the University of the Incarnate Word. She has taught for over 31 years in the fields of Asian and world history, migration studies, refugee issues, and human rights. Dr. Nath is a Fulbright Scholar and the recipient of the Social Science Research Council Award. At UIW, she was awarded the Edward A. Zlotowski Faculty Award for Service Learning, the Minnie Piper Award, UIW nominee, the Presidential Teaching Award, and the very prestigious Moody Professor Award. Her research expertise is on migration in Asia, human displacement, refugees, citizenship, and human rights. Her current research focuses on the Bhutanese refugee resettlement in the USA. Since 2010, she visited the Bhutanese refugee camps in Nepal 3 times to understand the Bhutanese refugee crisis, and also worked with resettled refugees in Columbus, Ohio, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. Currently, she's working on her book on the Bhutanese refugee resettlement in the United States. She has authored several articles in reputed journals on her research on the Bhutanese refugees. Dr. Nath is the past president of the Southwest Conference on Asian Studies, coordinator of the European, Middle Eastern, and Asian Studies at the Southwest Historical Association, and serves on the Catholic Charities Refugee Advisory Board and the Faculty Advisory Board of Institute of Texan Cultures, and is vice chair of the advisory board of the Etling Center for Civic Leadership. She is the co-director of the Cielo Unity in Action, a refugee mentoring program in San Antonio that helps refugees transition to life in America through women empowerment, ESL programs, tutoring, and other help that refugees need in collaboration with several community partners. So you see, Dr. Nath is very qualified and will give us a wonderful presentation tonight. Please enjoy.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I would like to extend my thanks to Lisa McNary, Director of the Alumni Association of UIW, Jorge, Gaby, and also Melissa, who first contacted me about this. So I'm here to talk about refugee resettlement, service learning and career opportunities, understanding the global crisis, and also building compassion. And this presentation will focus on the global refugee crisis and resettlement in the United States and its implications to both refugees and the American society. Students and faculty at the University of Incarnate Word for the last several years have worked with refugees through service learning projects, helped refugees transition to life in America, and many students have built on those experiences and have moved on to careers that have made an impact on bigger and greater needs of the society, both in the US and abroad. So this presentation will give you an example of those projects and experiences and how we have tried to build a more compassionate world. So as I start working, and you heard everything that Lisa said, this is a very passionate topic for me, as I myself have worked with refugees for several years now. So I would start with just bringing you snippets of little stories about different refugees that we have worked with over the years. Fatima, a young 22-year-old Rohingya refugee woman from Myanmar and mother of 3 sons, she fled with her husband first to Malaysia and then was resettled in the United States. Bahista was a young mother from Afghanistan who did not read and write even in her own language. Rehani Mibula was a young refugee from the Congo who fled the conflict with his parents to survive life in the United States. He worked 2 jobs to support his family and graduated with his health management from UIW. Dil, a young Bhutanese refugee who, even though she is now resettled in the United States, still lives her life looking after her in-laws and her children. So as I talk to you about this, please keep these stories in mind about these young refugees. Who are refugees? The 1951 Refugee Convention officially defined refugee as a person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reason of race, religion, nationality, membership in in a particular social or political group, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of this country. This definition was founded very limiting, and as time went by, conflicts escalated and refugee numbers kept on increasing. This saw several amendments to fit the issues in different parts of the globe. The 1967 Protocol, the 1969 Organization of African Unity Refugee Convention, the 1984 Cartagena Declaration, and the 1980 Dublin Agreement, all define how we look at and decide the refugee issues as numbers are growing every day as we speak. At this point, I would also like to point you to this definition by the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Most refugees are ordinary people living extraordinary lives, driven from their homes by fear, conflict, and persecution. They've had to give up jobs, possessions, dreams, even families in their struggle to survive. They remain one of the most vulnerable people in our societies. They need assistance and protection, and they need understanding. So as we talk about refugees, I also want to show you the numbers that are from the latest statistics by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees from 18th June 2020. And if you look at the numbers, you can see the numbers growing exponentially over the years. Every year the numbers increase. 79.5 million displaced people, of which 26 million refugees. 20.4 million are refugees under the UNHCR, with about 5.6 million as the Palestinian refugees under the UNRWA mandate. Of this, a new category was added, which was the 3.6 million Venezuelans displaced abroad. And as we go through this, through these numbers, it really strikes us that most of the refugees are now living as refugees in the least developed countries of the world. But of all these numbers, it is very astonishing to say that only about 1% of these refugees are resettled every year. So as we look and contemplate on these numbers, I also want to bring you to my own refugee research. And I just wanted to show you this little plaque that I found at a memorial, which tells you what and who these refugees feel and what they think about themselves. The love for one's nation and the hope of being home never leaves the heart of a refugee, no matter where an individual ends up. A refugee remains a refugee at heart forever. I still remember that day very well on a hot Texas afternoon when I was invited by an ESL teacher working with the Catholic Charities Refugee Program in San Antonio to deliver a talk on the Bhutanese refugee crisis. It was the year 2008 when the first batch of Bhutanese refugees began to arrive to different parts of the US, including San Antonio, Texas. The venue was right in the heart of San Antonio in the Gardendale apartments where, unknown to me, several Bhutanese refugee families were housed. I arrived very excited. By this time, I had done enough research of available literature on the Bhutanese refugee problem to be confident of the historical background and the facts to be able to do a presentation. When I arrived at the venue and waited for the host to get there, I saw a big group of young Bhutanese Nepalis standing outside in a heated discussion among themselves. They looked really agitated. Since I understood Nepali, I knew what they were saying, and it really shook me. Who was I to talk about the refugees? What did I know of their experience? How could I know what they had faced in their life in the camps? They have suffered, not me. And the articles and books only gave me one side of the story. The day was saved that day when Ganesh, one of the older refugees, intervened and he offered to share the experiences of the refugees while I presented the historical background and other factual details. I breathed a sigh of relief. But I learned a very important lesson as a researcher that day. I realized that the refugees were correct. How was I equipped to talk about the life and experiences? I had not lived their life or experienced any of what they have gone through. Reading books and online research knowledge was no matter or no match for the real life experiences. It was then that I decided that I had to visit the refugee camps to get a true insight into the lives of these people that I was hoping one day to write about. I had to go there, see where they came to America from, how their lives were in the camps, and more importantly, to collect the testimonies of the people who have lived that life. My own research focus thus took me all the way to the refugee camps of Nepal, and also to understand the Bhutanese refugee crisis. The Bhutanese refugees are twice displaced. They started leaving Bhutan in the 1990s after going through a progressive and systemic exclusion from their homeland. They saw their citizenship rights being taken away from them. They were excluded from institutions that were important for them. They found their language, their dress, religion, customs, everything being excluded from the national narrative. They were forced to speak the Dzongkha language, wear the Bhutanese national dress, all in the name of Driglam Namza, or one nation, one people policy. They were slowly eliminated from political participation. They required a no objection certificate for everything, even to get treatment at a hospital, to get married, apply for a scholarship, or to go and get a higher education. And as they protested, the harassment became so serious that it started affecting their daily existence and made them uncertain about their life and future in Bhutan. It was a forced deportation on the pain of incarceration, persecution, and even death. And they started leaving. They left in groups, a few families, a whole village, cousins, relatives, families got separated. Sons who were in the capital city of Thimphu or elsewhere for work returned home to find that their parents and family had left in the back of trucks and also on foot. Ganesh told me that my parents were old and couldn't walk. So I put them in a truck with the children and the women, and I walked. A lot of them tell the story of their difficult and painful journey on the back of open trucks to the homeland Nepal. The Nepal government had no other option but to offer them refuge and set up camps in the southeastern Nepal. The Bhutanese found refuge in these 7 camps The last one of Beldangi was even extended. By September 1995, there were about 90,000 refugees in the camps. By October 2006, with new entrants and children born in the camps, the number swelled to about 107,000 registered. And I will say the word registered because all refugees were not registered in the camps. All my reading and talking to the Bhutanese refugees in San Antonio and in the US had not prepared me for this experience in the camps. Despite the aid, the camp conditions were pathetic, as you can see in the slides. At a first glance, they looked like any ordinary poor village in Nepal. But as one got closer, one could see the housing walls covered with plastic sheets, paper, straw, and bamboo with thatched roofs, which was telling of the impermanent nature of the construction. After all, they were refugee housing, and the refugees were not expected to live there for long. But this semi-permanent housing became their home for the next 22 years. The huts were very close to each other. There was very narrow pathways in between them. There was very bad sanitary condition. They were not well lighted, and to ward off the cold in winter, the houses were covered in newspaper on the inside. To many refugees in all the camps that I visited, the future was bleak. Men, women, and children lived their lives on a day-to-day basis, hoping for some change in their plight. The only hope that they had was being resettled in a third country. Every Thursday, the UNHCR ground officer brought a list of those who were selected for resettlement. Sometimes names were called out aloud. That was the one exciting day of the week. For many, these Thursdays changed their lives forever. And for others, it was another disappointment. And one more week, probably months and years to wait before their names were found their way on the list. Over time, however, the international donors had also grown increasingly reluctant to continue funding. There was aid fatigue. It was too long. Even refugees with poor English skills knew the words languishing and warehouse and used them frequently to describe the situation in the camps. My research experience took me to this most amazing experience of my life, and I will never forget the people that I met during the several visits to the camps. I interacted with camp refugees from several walks of life: doctors, healthcare workers, teachers, educators, and women groups, workers working with disabled children, elderly people who would never leave, and those who worked at the stone quarries who could never leave. I also met Sonam, the little boy in the picture, who became my guide. A young boy about 21 years old who worked with the youth group, was an artist, a writer, and a poet, a singer, and an actor, and was studying to be a health worker, but who could never leave as his father wanted to go back to Bhutan someday. Since 2008, we find that almost 96,000 Bhutanese refugees have been resettled in the United States of America. Others have gone to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Denmark, and Sweden. After 20 years or more in the refugee camps, all efforts by the UN to repatriate the refugees back to Bhutan, third country resettlement became the only solution. And in 2018, only about 7,000 refugees have remained in the 2 of the 7 camps. A decade of resettlement and one of the greatest success stories of third country resettlement. But they were still fraught with a lot of questions. Now, what do we understand by resettlement? The UNHCR has laid down 3 possible solutions to a refugee crisis. The first of those is repatriation. Repatriation is sending the refugees back to their home country voluntarily. The second is labeled the host country integration, where the refugees are given the option to stay in the country where they became refugees, provided the host country can afford it or has the resources. Third country resettlement is the last and the only solution that happens when the first 2 fail. A lot of the refugees that arrive in the United States are resettled in this country. Refugees are offered resettlement by Western or first world nations because they have the resources and the space to afford the refugees. Once they arrive in the US, they are assisted by the United States Council for Catholic Bishops through different voluntary agencies, namely the Catholic Charities, the World Lutheran Services, RICES, etc. They come with refugee travel card. They are heavily vetted, one-way tickets to America. They receive a social security number. They have work authorization. They can apply for permanent residency and green card in a year. And they go to school, they work, they have the same opportunities as any American. But yet they need help to assimilate. They come from a different culture and they adjust to life in the United States. And all of this needs a lot of help. One of the most daunting fact about refugee resettlement in the United States is seen on this graph from 2008 to 18. And we can see the dwindling numbers of the refugees being admitted in the United States in the recent years. And as we see, the last number that we have is from 2018, where the number or the ceiling of refugee acceptance was brought down to 45,000, with only about 16,230 refugees being admitted in 2018. So as we can understand, this kind of explains how the numbers keep fluctuating and the refugee numbers are only limited to 1% of refugees being admitted or resettled in the third country. I was very fortunate to capture these pictures at the Bhadrapur airport in Nepal in the camps, as they were making their first journey out to America. And as you look at the pictures, I'm sure you are struck by the look of worry and scare and fear that you see in their faces. The IOM, or International Organization for Migration officials, are dealing with this harrowing task of getting the refugees organized to board a flight out of the Bhadrapur airport to Kathmandu and then onto their long and onward journey to the United States. As they arrive in America, they are very excited. Life is good here and we feel safe. I can work and I can get paid for the number of hours I work. Nobody cheats me here. I just have to work very hard. I've even received a certificate of recognition. As soon as I landed in San Antonio, I knew I was going to be safe. All the years of suffering and hopelessness just faded away. I feel dizzy. I feel like I'm flying. Nobody walks here. Today, I saw 400 cars and only 4 people on the road. These were some of the candid comments of the Bhutanese refugees resettled in San Antonio, Texas. Some of them recent arrivals. It was amusing, sad, happy, and real. But it was an honest expression about the feelings about resettlement as they began to arrive in the US. As we look at the refugee resettlement, one of the most interesting facts about refugee resettlement is that of the challenges of resettlement. My research with the refugees took me to several cities around the United States to connect my research and get more data on the Bhutanese refugees. Very soon, these became trips to family homes as they were so welcoming. What was just a trip to collect data became amazing life stories of hardship and struggle to meet the challenges of resettlement. Life in America for many Bhutanese refugees was a big shock, and not just Bhutanese, all refugees. A 2010 US Senate report mentions that resettlement efforts in many US cities are underfunded, overstretched, and failing to meet the basic needs of the refugee population they're currently asked to assist. To many refugees, overcoming these challenges becomes the most important aspect of their life in America during the first few years. Learning English is the first and the most important challenge. These pictures that you see are very heartwarming as they're trying to get some kind of English skills at the Spoken English Center in the Beldangi refugee camp in Nepal. I had the good fortune of volunteering at this refugee camp. And if you can see on the board, you have a teacher who is a refugee herself, who has learned English probably in the refugee camp or an English school in India or Nepal, and was trying to teach the refugees before their journey into America. But as we move forward, we can see that learning English is one of the most daunting challenges that the refugees face. I met with Ram Bishwa, who is only 50 years old, and it is very difficult for him to manage and find a job to sustain himself and his family without proper language skills. He was a farmer, and this is what he told me. I was a farmer and never went to school. I never touched a pen and paper in my life. But now in America, I have to do everything in English. I have to eat in English, sit in English, walk in English, etc. They become highly dependent on their children who attend school in America to become the interpreters for their parents and grandparents. Even after 10 years of being in a refugee camp, and after 10 years of being in the United States, most refugees still feel that the biggest challenge is the inability to learn and be fluent in English. Employment is the next important challenge. Employment is the path to self-sufficiency as stated in the US 1980 Refugee Act policy. Many Bhutanese refugees, despite having postgraduate and professional qualifications, are underemployed. This is the same with many refugees that come to America. The American job market is culturally and socially different from their lives in the refugee camps. As one refugee who worked at a hotel in San Antonio told me, I have to work very hard and all I do is work and I still don't have enough money. The emphasis on finding employment, maintaining the jobs, puts a heavy strain on family structures as everybody is hoping for the American dream. Also, the biggest challenge is faced by the elderly. Life has become one big vacuum for the elderly. They struggle with the ESL and citizenship classes. Most of them never went to school. They don't know how to read and write. The elderly parents and grandparents, some of whom who are not even more than 56 years old. And this was an interview I had with Mr. Dhimal in Columbus, Ohio. What do I do? I cannot speak English. I'm 56 years old. I cannot go to work. I cannot do anything. I want to work. I want to do what I have been doing my entire life. I want to be active, but all I do is stay home. I have to keep quiet because I cannot speak English. They see the intergenerational problems with their grandchildren. The grandparents suffer from lack of exposure, a loss of language, a communication gap with their grandkids, and the future seems like a blur. They're getting depressed and becoming sick. And one of the worst and saddest instances of this, of the Bhutanese refugee resettlement was the high rate of suicide, which brought the Bhutanese refugee resettlement under a lot of scrutiny. There were large instances and the numbers of suicide were even higher than the US rate. They suffer in silence and go into depression. A large number of the suicide cases are women, and that raises another question about the role of family structures and the domestic abuse among the refugees. Was it a failure to adjust and cope with the challenges of resettlement as the CDC thinks it is? Or was it something that they brought with them from home? Was it their culture? So these are questions which we are still trying to find an answer to. However, we are also blown away and we see the success of the refugees in the United States. In 2019, Bhuvan Pokral became the first Bhutanese refugee to be elected to the District of Columbus in Ohio. Since 2010, Ohio began to see a big wave of secondary migration from all over the United States to the different cities of Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Akron, etc., till the population grew to over a count of over 20,000. The reasons for the move was the need for community, the need to be with their brothers and sisters, be close where they can have their religious festivals and their priests to conduct prayers. The Bhutanese successfully found jobs at the local businesses of the area, and also with the University of Ohio system. They're buying houses. A visible sign of the success was the home ownership and the big cars, establishing businesses and restaurants and engaging in a better community. The Bhutanese Community Center began to develop programs for the children, the youth, and raise awareness of issues that plague the community. Amidst all the challenges were stories of successful resettlement and community building. They devised a support system that worked for all, and every effort was made to bring up those who lagged behind. They're becoming American citizens, but yet they're trying to keep their culture alive. The question of citizenship weighed heavily on the minds of these refugees as they were questioning their own hyphenated identities of Bhutanese, Nepali, and American. But at the same time, they are also forging a sense of identity among their children and grandchildren. They're trying to keep their cultures and relationships strong. They're trying to celebrate their festivals and making sure that their children understand their customs, cultures, and traditions. And these are very heartwarming pictures of the refugees celebrating their festivals and meeting with friends and families, and also becoming American citizens. All of this work, my own work with the refugees, also brought me to devise ways to educate my students about the refugee crisis. Service learning is an important tool for the teachers and for the students alike to try and apply their academic learning to the needs of the society and the community. Learning occurs through action and reflection, building cross-cultural understanding, and build a compassion and make them enlightened cultures. The whole goal of this service learning projects is to educate the students on the greatest global humanitarian crisis of the 21st century, and also bring them face to face with the most vulnerable population groups in the world. And as we talk about vulnerable population groups, we also have to focus on children, women, and large families with only one earning member who need a lot of help. So how does the global refugee class at UIW work? The purpose is, as I mentioned, to educate and create awareness about the refugee crisis among our student population. They are encouraged to become volunteers with the CLO Unity in Action and Mentoring a Refugee Family program. This has been a part of the UIW Interfaith Initiative starting as early as 2015. It means CLO stands for Community Interfaith Education Literacy Opportunity. And through that, we have been able to develop a very strong refugee mentoring program. Even now, during the pandemic, we are offering ESL classes through Zoom. Our students are going and working with the refugees at their urban garden. So service learning became a very important component of this class. The students work with refugee families for over 2 to 3 hours a week. Now, what do the students do and how is this course set up? So one of the first is to connect with our community partners. We had worked for many years with the Catholic Charities, with the Center for Refugee Services, and now we are working with our own mentoring program and also with RICES. So the students go through an extensive background checks, and then we arrange meet and greet with visit with the refugees so that they can go and we can start pairing them with the refugee families with whom we're going to spend the whole semester. And one of the questions that I get asked is, what do the students do? What are we expecting them to do? This is very simple, but at the same time, it is also very complicated. You can see the list of these little clip arts on the screen, and that is exactly what the students do. What do we help them with? What is acceptable in the American culture? So everything from ESL to grocery shopping to how to use a laundry machine to finding the street names to finding the bus routes to reading what the school sends home, all the notes, to when to call 911 and when to go to a hospital. So these are simple things that we take for granted, but these are also things that we have to help the refugees with. A very important component of this are the reflections. Every week, we have ongoing reflection activity. This is a very important and the most important component of a service learning project. We talk to the class about their experiences, the problems that they are facing with working with the refugees. And remember that the students are very new to this. So they need strong support, a lot of cultural orientation, and we provide them that. How their shared experiences can help with the problem solving. So the students gain knowledges, they learn lessons, it affects their understanding of similar situations in their own personal lives. They're always telling me stories about how it showed them a different perspective. And overall, we are introducing students to ideas of compassion, empathy, global conflict, and its impact on civilian lives. But most important, I think, is also to see how do the refugees benefit. As we look at this, the main purpose of this is that we can offer this help to the refugees. They get help on areas that are very challenging to them. They learn to trust the American people. They benefit from having someone answer the questions and to teach them about life in America. These students are building bridges. And at the same time, you will see the numbers. Over the years, I have lost count of how many students and how many families we have helped. Just to give you an example, every semester we help over 10 to 15 families of 8 to 10 people per family. So if you do the count, you can see how many refugees we are helping on a day-to-day basis. And it extends to children, it extends to women, it extends to anything that they need help with. How does it impact the students? They develop strong bonds with the families and children, as you can see in these little pictures here, that they look so happy. They learn about different cultures and sharing. There's always an exchange of food. There's always an exchange of different aspects of the culture. They start learning languages, and they also develop a sense of community. But it's not just limited to the students and the refugees. It also extends to the larger community, to their families. The students are going and working, bringing their families into these refugee homes. So here, as you can see in these pictures, they're going to the Alamo, they're going everywhere. And in all of this, we find that they are joined by their friends, by their families, by their boyfriends. And also in this picture with the box, you see that there was a family that did a donation drive for the refugee family and sent them gifts for Christmas. So these are instances where there is a big spillover effect into the larger community. And as we see, this is a slide that the students created for me. Family is more important than anything. And when family is united, there's no war that can divide the strength of love between them. Through adversity, together as one, they can surpass it all. And as you see these happy pictures from the Congo, from Eritrea, and from Syria. And I just wanted to tell you the story of this family from Syria. The student who was working, one of the students that was working was told by her own family never to work with a Syrian family. Does I do anything you can work with anyone but a Syrian family? And as you know, students, she went and she was by chance, she was paired with a Syrian family, and she was very adamant. She said, I love them, I'm going to work. And one day her parents came and visited the Syrian family. And as they were leaving, the mother had tears in her eyes, and she said, what was I thinking? They are the most beautiful family that I have ever seen. They enjoyed tea, they enjoyed the hospitality, and they, went back with a heart full of love. So as I move forward and I'm getting close towards the end of my presentation, I also wanted to tell you, how does it help the students in their career path? This picture is of a former student of mine, Raymond Tagle, who is a UIW alumni, who is now an associate program officer for the UNHCR, and he's posted in Sudan. Just a few days back, Raymond was in San Antonio. He's from San Antonio. He visited home for his rest and rehabilitation, and he came and he did a presentation for my class. And one of the things that Raymond said really touched me. He said that I would not be here working for the UN Refugee Agency if I had not taken this Global Refugee class. The experience that you get from volunteering does not go to waste. Every little piece of work that you do will ultimately add to your resume. So I have seen this, and I've told my students that it is a big resume booster. You're working with a diverse population group. You're volunteering. You're helping a vulnerable population group. So you're working with the community. You're working with a different culture. All of this helps boosting your resume. So students have gone on to work with different agencies like the United Nations, UNHCR, Caritas, Catholic Charities, RIACES. These are directly related to the refugees. But beyond that, I've had students go and work for different nonprofits, teaching. You are already helping with English teaching and other ESL teaching. So I have a lot of students who were tutoring and have gone on to become teachers. Graduate school, masters and PhDs, research, and the list is endless. You will find opportunities, and working with or any kind of service learning or volunteering will always add a big boost to your resume. So as I end this presentation, I would just like to tell you and point that those who opt for resettlement and arrive in the US are eager to begin a new life and see a future for themselves. As many have remarked that there was a kind of security about their children's future, a feeling that they had lost during the past 20 years. Many see their life in America with its diversity and added advantage and do not feel the sense of isolation that they have been used to. They feel free and liberated. And as we get there, I would also like once again to draw attention to one thing. Please understand that the refugees in the United States are here due to third country resettlement. Let us not confuse them with migrants and illegal immigration. They come here through a long vetting process, which takes anywhere from 18 months to 2 years. They're legal here and they pay taxes. They are part of the US government's refugee policy enacted in the 1980s. And since then, the United States has admitted over 3 million refugees. To most refugees, this is the last and their only option. So as I said, many see life in America as an added advantage and the American diversity, and do not feel the same sense of isolation that they were used to. They feel free and liberated. They fear a loss of their culture and the new challenges that this will bring. Like most victim diaspora, they cling on to the collective memory and myth about the homeland, its location and achievements. They feel the loss of their homeland and hope that only time will heal, because most refugees even do not go back. All refugees live in hope. A decade later, an assessment of the Bhutanese refugee resettlement in America reveals a story of resilience, brotherhood, and community building to ensure a balanced life in the US. while they assimilate structurally by participating in American institutions and American life, culturally and socially, the refugees retain an element of nostalgia in creating aspects of their homeland in this new home, which gives them something, and especially to the different generations of refugees, to hold on to in a land far from home. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Nath. We do have a few questions for you that have come through Facebook Live. The first one, let's see. What is the difference between a refugee and asylum?
Do you want to tell me the questions so that I can, if there are similar questions, then I can club them?
Oh, sure. And yes, and then which refugees are eligible for resettlement in the U.S.? And what is the vetting process for refugees coming to the U.S.? And then the last one, how does the number of refugees compare to other types of immigrants? Some very tough questions there.
Okay. So the first question was, what is the difference between asylum and refugees? Asylum is the process of getting refuge in any country. A refugee is a person that is a designated or a defined term for someone who tries to seek refuge. As I mentioned earlier in the definition, that anybody who flees the country and crosses an international border and cannot go back to their home country due to the fear of persecution are labeled refugees. And also in many cases, refugees are, in many ways, they are also asylum seekers, and they have to cross an international border. So they get refugee status. And once they get refugee status, which is given to them based on the conditions of their forced migration, then they are given every other support that they can avail themselves. They come under the mandate of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who takes care of them and decides what to do with the refugees. So the next question was, Lisa, about the vetting process.
Yes, which refugees are eligible for resettlement in the U.S.?
So
what's the vetting process?
Okay. So as we look at every refugee actually who is stranded in a refugee camp around the globe is eligible for resettlement. So as I mentioned earlier in one of the slides, is that the UNHCR has 3 possible solutions to a refugee crisis anywhere in the world. The first one is repatriation. That is the first and one that the most refugees want. And that is to go back to their home country, which is repatriation back to their home country. Most refugees are really, really interested in that option. The second one is host country integration, where refugees will be resettled and integrated in the country where they became refugees or where they got asylum in the first place. And the last one, the last and the only possible solution when the other 2 fail is that of third country resettlement. So if the first, and all of these options are voluntary. So you cannot force a refugee from being repatriated if the conflict is still persisting, or you cannot force them to stay in the host country, or you cannot force them to resettle. All of these are voluntary options. So when all options fail, refugees will hope for, and what was the other option of staying in a refugee camp forever? And as I mentioned, that does not work well because we see there is an aid fatigue. the aids keep dwindling, and then the refugees are left with nothing. And so the only other option is to end the refugee crisis, is to find a good home for them. And third country resettlement becomes the only option. Now, the US refugee policy has changed, especially after 9/11. And so you can go to YouTube and you will find several videos on the vetting process. And especially as we all know and we all agree that national security is very, very important. And talking about national security, we also agree that we cannot allow, there is always an infiltration of rebels and terrorists, etc., maybe among the refugee groups or in the refugee camps, because most refugees are fleeing from their country to the next country. And so there is always a spillover effect or a spillover of the conflict. So when the US or the UNHCR is deciding on the refugees coming into the US, there is almost a 10-point vetting process. So the vetting process goes from just a first background check to a second background check, to a third background check, to a fingerprinting, to testing the fingerprinting around all the websites. So the FBI, the CIA, the Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the state government, everybody is involved, and all their databases are checked and rechecked before they finally give them the green signal to come to the US. So it is not the UNHCR alone. It is the International Organization for Migration. It is the state government. It is the state defense department. It is the Homeland Security. So everybody is vetted. And one of the interesting statistics is that in all these years, there were only 3 people in the US that were suspected of terrorist, planned terrorist acts. And that was, the one in Wisconsin and 2 in Wisconsin, Iraqi refugees. So only 3 in all these years. So it is even less than 1%, I guess, 0.1%. But again, that is also something we need to rule out. So the refugees do go through a very intensive vetting process.
Thank you, Dr. Nath. I believe that's all the questions that we have. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge with all of us.